a slightly different aspect of information politics in authoritarian regimes, which is information gathering, and specifically information gathering and selective welfare provision. So the motivation for this project is that I was in China doing field work in 2012 on something slightly different. I was trying to see if ordinary Chinese citizens could influence social policy outcomes. Specifically, I was looking at the Dibao program, which is a non-conditional cash transfer program. And at some point while doing this field work, someone told me, if you really want to understand this program, you have to go to urban neighborhoods. Neighborhoods are units at the smallest administrative unit in urban China. There are a few thousand households. They're equivalent to villages in rural China. And that's where these programs are administered by something called a residential committee. So I spent lots of time going to lots of different residential committees, visiting lots of different neighborhoods, talking to people who live there, to residential committees, and actually found something else that was really striking and different from what I was originally setting out to study. And so I'll give you an example of this difference just using two neighborhoods in Qingdao. These two neighborhoods were very similar looking. They were very close to one another, but they had very different outcomes in terms of this Dibao program. So in the first neighborhood, there was a family, I'm going to call them the Wang family, where the husband was unemployed, the wife was a street vendor, and they had a son who was in elementary school. So the husband usually actually worked with the wife doing street vending, but he was injured and so he couldn't work. The wife was feeling a lot of pressure to provide for the whole family, so she approached her residential committee to try to apply for this non-conditional cash transfer program for low-income households. When she approached them, she was told that she didn't even need to apply. Because why? Because she had relatives that she could get money from, because she was in the prime of health and she could find additional employment to supplement her income. Okay. In the second neighborhood, I met a family I'll call the Li family. There again, the husband was unemployed, the wife was also informally employed, and they had a teenage son. In this case, their local residential committee actually helped them obtain Dibao in a few weeks' time. And more generally, if I look at these neighborhoods, in the first neighborhood, if you look at who's receiving these benefits, it's really the elderly individuals who are extremely sick. They have no ability to engage in any sort of employment, and they don't have extended family support. In contrast, in the second neighborhood, you also see these elderly and sick recipients for the Dibao program, but you also see unemployed workers and former prisoners, people who are able to work but who are unemployed, receiving these benefits. So the question then I turned to was, what explains why the Wang family was why the Li family was proactively given Dibao and the Wang family was told not to apply? And then more generally, why is it that only the old and infirm receive Dibao in neighborhood 1, while those who are able-bodied receive Dibao in neighborhood 2? And what I argue is that the explanation for this lies in something I call selective welfare provision, which is targeting Dibao to individual households not only for their economic hardships, but also for the potential threat they pose to social disorder. So when you dig further into these stories, in the Li family, Mr. Li was actually recently released from prison, and when he was incarcerated, he had become injured, and he felt that he should receive some compensation from the state. So he was considering going to the local government to petition. He was considering this, and his menlojang, so a woman who lived in his entryway, who I'll talk about more, discovered his desire to petition. She told the local residential committee, and they immediately met with him lots of times and got him Dibao to, quote, stabilize his, sorry, this is in Chinese, to stabilize his mental condition so that he wouldn't go petition. In this neighborhood, the residential committee works really closely with these menlojang, who I call block captains, to gather information about local residents, but also they see themselves as helping local residents. In neighborhood 1, there's also a residential committee, and there are also also these block captains, but they are unfamiliar with the circumstances of the local population. And what I argue is that it's this difference in access to information, this difference in abilities to gather information that allows some neighborhoods to engage in selective welfare provision to try to preempt disruptions to social stability. And I should note that this what I'm presenting today is one chapter of a broader book project on selective welfare provision. So let me talk a little bit more about what selective welfare provision is. It's the distribution of benefits under a public social policy scheme that has the goal of trying to preempt social disruption. It's selective in the sense that it's provided to people who I call potential disruptors, not to people who I call well-behaved or ill-behaved. So let me define what I mean by these terms. Someone who is, let's start with ill-behaved, is someone who has just engaged in protest or petition or social disruption. Someone who is well-behaved is someone who hasn't engaged in any of those actions. And a potential disruptor is someone who has not yet engaged in those actions, but threatens to engage in those actions, or is perceived to have the threat or the potential to engage in those actions. And the important thing here is that I'm talking about the period immediately prior to the distribution of benefits. So some of you might know that in China there's also research been done on buying off protesters. So someone protests and the local government gives them money to go home. In that case, that's an instance of distributing material benefits to the ill-behaved, someone who's just engaged in social disruption. What I'm looking at are people who, in that prior period, did not do any of those things. Maybe in the distant past, they petitioned or did something socially disruptive, but right before the distribution of benefits, they're not engaging in those actions. Okay. Also, selective welfare provision is selective in that the benefits are distributed before the disruption has occurred, obviously, and that occurs within this broader social policy scheme. So the thing to note is that it requires, to do this, it requires information about private preferences and inclinations. Because people haven't revealed themselves, they haven't engaged in any sort of public behavior. So this necessitates a regime obtaining information that is private. And that's hard to do. And the other thing is that there requires some sort of concealment of the instrumental exchange of benefits for an action. So if everyone knew that all you have to do is threaten something in order to get benefits, then everyone would engage in threats, right? It's a very easy and cheap thing to do. So there's incentive to try to hide this exchange. And in part, the distribution of benefits under a social policy program that has a complex set of rules does that. Because these people who are receiving benefits are facing economic hardships. So the additional criteria that's being used is more difficult to observe. So the data that I'm going to show you today is based on neighborhood interviews with residential committees and residents in 4 cities in different parts of China. In those cities, we selected 21 central districts and conducted interviews in 97 neighborhoods out of 100 that were selected. So how do we measure information gathering capacity? We measure that by whether residents in the neighborhood can recall the surname of their block captain. And we also collected information about how many block captains there are, how often they meet with the residential committee. We found that in order to measure how penetrated these block captains were, we had to look at whether people living in that neighborhood actually knew who they were. Because that's a measure of them interacting with these residents. The second thing is, how do I measure potential disruptors? So me, as a outside researcher, necessarily know less. I can't know more. I can't really know more than the local residential committee. So how do I measure potential disruptors? I use a proxy, which is whether former prisoners are among DBAL recipients. So I just want to note that this is a rough proxy, and that there may be former prisoners who are not potential disruptors, but based on conversations prior to the survey, we had some indications that this would be a relatively good indicator of potential disruption. And then how do we measure well-behaved? We measure that by looking at how, among DBAL recipients, whether they're the disabled. Okay. And then we also have gathered lots of information to try to proxy for the income and demographic information of these neighborhoods. And I should note that in China, there's not that much data that's really disaggregated to the neighborhood level. So just a little bit of descriptive statistics in the last 2 minutes, last 1 minute, is that block captains are basically in all neighborhoods. But very few, in only a third of neighborhoods, do residents actually know who the block captains are. That means that most neighborhoods have this institution, but they're not able to really penetrate and gather information in most of these neighborhoods. So what I find in this plot is that on the y-axis here is probability of former prisoners among DBAL recipients. And there are three things here. In neighborhoods with high information gathering capacity, in neighborhoods with low information gathering capacity, and then the difference between the two. So what we see here is that in neighborhoods where there is this high information gathering capacity, it's much more likely that former prisoners are among those who receive DBAL. And that difference compared to neighborhoods with low information gathering capacity is significant. In contrast, what we look at here now on the y-axis is the probability of the disabled among DBAL recipients. There, it's quite high in all types of neighborhoods, but it's significantly lower in the high information gathering neighborhoods than those, the low information gathering capacity neighborhoods. So just to sum up, what we show through this data is that recipients of DBAL are more likely to be former prisoners when only in neighborhoods that can gather detailed information about individuals. And the implications of this is that welfare distribution in a public social policy scheme can be strategic and selective. It can be aimed at trying to preempt social disruption, not just reacting to it. And it can be targeted at the individual level, not just at broad regions or at cities versus urban areas versus rural areas. So thank you so much. Look forward to your comments.